Houston, I want to thank you for welcoming me. I want to thank our organizers and sponsors. This is really, DevOps Days are wonderful events that take a community, are representative of it. But I wish I had a better attribution for this, but there is a Chinese proverb that says, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. This talk is part of a series of talks and articles that I've written. And in a previous one, Sean Moten, you here? He was supposed to be here. Anyway, he had helped me. He was my editor for the first talk in the series called Fear and Loathing in Systems Administration. Excuse me, I'm come from Orlando, so everywhere I go is relatively dry. But in Fear and Loathing in Systems Administration, I discuss how to identify products within your organization and that DevOps doesn't work. Because DevOps is a concept, it's a philosophy, and it's a professional movement based on mutual trust and respect. And encourages collaboration among teams to align them to business goals. A concept doesn't do work, and a philosophy doesn't meet goals. People do. Remember, just like Soylent Green, DevOps is made up of people. In there, I also introduced the DevOps drinking game. Contributions are welcome. Now, as a follow-up to that, I wrote another article called Comfortably Numb, or describing corporal analgesia, how organizations set up around job function are actively harmful. The corporate analgesia that sets in, it isolates pain and makes it easier to ignore the people experiencing that pain, and it enables unsustainable business practices. Now, I prefer questions at the end because I'm going to go fast. But if at any time you're feeling overwhelmed, please say the safe word clearly, and we'll take a little break. Let's get on with the show. First, I need to know who you are. How many here are first-time DevOps Days attendees? Holy crap. It's usually a lot in any given one, but this is like over 90%. That's fantastic. So as far as job role, how many of you are in, say, systems or ops, networking, storage, things like that? Show of hands. Okay, about a little less than a quarter. How about software development, to include architecture? About the same. Interesting. How about DBA or security? Can't wait to see what I'm missing here. How about management or product? I often joke and say that this is people who used to be useful but now do other things. Okay, right on. How about other business, like not non-hard tech? This could be financial or legal, HR, administrative. I see a couple of hands, and that's fantastic. What job roles have I missed? I don't think all the hands went up. You make your own way. Okay, independent consulting. Anything else? QA. I did miss that. Oh. Thank you. Yes. Well, welcome. Now, again, welcome to the DevOps community, where we have it's implicit and understood that we have a culture of mutual respect. Our organizers didn't mention this, but there is a code of conduct for DevOps Day. All DevOps Days have a similar code of conduct. Now, you personally may object to being subject to one. Honestly, it doesn't matter. You still have to obey by it. It's not there to protect you if you don't think it is, but it really is. DevOps is also hugs. I love hugs. DevOps is offering hugs. If you're just not comfortable, it's okay. Now, using my extensive senior engineer design skills, I translated the idea of offering hugs to tech terms. First, you figure out where you're addressing. You offer a sin, hey, hug. An act, the other person, or a sin act, the other person acknowledges, yes, I'm ready to move in for the hug. And then the act, you actually engage in it. Now, if at any part that thing falls apart, you don't conclude the transaction. Do not surprise hug people unless you know them. Like, I can run up on Aaron and have very little fear of causing a code of conduct violation. Hi, I'm Waldo. I work for Datadog. I used to be a productive member of society, but now I'm a tech evangelist. I traded one set of bad life decisions for another. But this talk isn't about Datadog. In fact, this is as much as you're going to see about them in the talk. This talk isn't endorsed by anyone. This is me. Just a boy standing in front of his community, asking it to try to make things a little better. Now, there are plenty of articles that talk about doing DevOps and aligning authority with responsibility, but what does that look like in practice? Before we talk about that, I want to discuss some particularly damning problems that these approaches can help address. Year after year, Gallup polling reports that only 34% of employees feel actively engaged. And it varies, but somewhere around 15% feel actively disengaged. And so that means just over 50% of your employees are what they categorize as not engaged. Like, they're there, they're doing their job, but they're not happy, they're not fulfilled. Now, it would be bad enough if you were only paying for these same people out of dollars, the same who are actively disengaged versus the ones who are actively engaged. But that's just not the case. So on top of actual dollars for their time, disengagement tends to spread, and it's harder to rein in than engagement. Now, I'm not going to talk about burnout, except as a common symptom, because I'm frankly not qualified to give any meaningful advice, medical advice on the subject. However, burnout and attrition are more prevalent when people feel disempowered and disengaged. See, people are squishy. Without talking to them, or at least doing long-term observation, it's nearly impossible to determine whether individuals or teams are engaged or what their capacity looks like. With that said, I've been in many orgs that just didn't ask what the operational capacity and load looked like. But they still had more apps and features to publish. And this is that corporal analgesia thing again. When the team that runs things is somewhere over there, when somebody else carries the pager for your feature, you don't know what the operational load is. And you're numb to its failures and the problems it creates. See, it's much easier to turn out legacy apps than not. Now, I define legacy as things that no longer match the current ideal paradigm, and it often happens when an application has no clear owner. Choosing your right software so as to be maintained requires conscious decisions. So I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the definitive DevOps implementation. Now, you'll hear that startups do DevOps out of necessity, but generally they're not large enough to have these kinds of problems that you have to consider. But when you need to scale up and split teams, you might as well do it right. What we commonly have now is an org chart designed for the 1850s railroad, which aligns to job titles. But from this, you can't infer the business goals. You can't see what it considers important. This often results in confusion, pain, blame, and burnout. As an added bonus, if your funding model for development is the studio model, where engineers work on a project, a capital P project, and then hand it over to another team to deal with later, congratulations, you found a really efficient way to turn out legacy code. But let's face it, your CEO can't and shouldn't care that you wrote code real well. They care that the features and products are available so they can bring in money. See, the studio model is a way of funding teams that is patterned after movie and game studios. It works really well if you're releasing a product that doesn't have an operational component. Studios make a lot of sense if you're making a film or a standalone game. It's done when it's released. Some applications like standalone games or mobile apps that don't have an online a backing service component, they also fit this model well. The problem comes when you try to apply a studio model to something that requires a service. If you're treating your development as a project, but the application is a service, that service has to be maintained. You're handing it off to people who are less qualified to make decisions about its future, who are less familiar with it. And that's just wrong. So who is doing that software maintenance? Now, if the funding wasn't cut, it'll be an implied, if not outright stated, maintenance team who has to clean up the mess. If there's no funding, you're dumping it on ops to deal with, who had nothing to do with its development. The idea behind a product team is that it is a long-lived, sustainable, and self-contained organization that is solely responsible for solving problems and the products that solve those problems. They build and run them. The products have well-defined responsibilities and borders, interfaces, and describe a contract for how you interact with them. Now, before I talk about anything else, I have to make one thing perfectly clear. If you have a role in functional leadership, say as a development manager or an operations director, your title or role is very likely to change under this model, but should be for the better. See, in product teams, the product owner decides the work that is to be done and its priorities. Now, briefly, a brief word on terminology. So I am, let's say, unenlightened in the Agile and Scrum word. I don't use capital A Agile, and I've been victim to the term Scrum meaning a quick meeting. So for anybody who cares, I apologize in advance. I think the terms product owner and product manager are backwards, and I use them largely interchangeably, so indulge me for the next 20 minutes. So, what do the managers and directors do now? I'm glad you asked. How many here in this room are engineering or ops, like who are functional management? Show of hands real quick. Okay, fair number. Presumably, you were promoted to this role because you were good at your job, but now your job has fundamentally changed. I don't need a show of hands here, but think about how many of you actually miss engineering, but now you spend all your time doing stuff. If product is what gets you excited, maybe it's time for a change. Consider becoming a product owner. Now, this role is a lot of things, but you are focused on the product. You're focused on solving the business problems. As you see here, we have a quick breakdown of, actually, the slides will be available later. We can look at the breakdown later, but fundamentally, the product owner runs the product team, defines priorities, weighs in on battles between individual engineers in the product team. The functional manager, there's still a role for that, but it's more a community-driven role where they coordinate knowledge and sharing. But the teams are isolated behind APIs so they can decide their own implementation details, their Scrum paths, their Scrum periods, their CI and deployment methodologies, because it doesn't matter to anybody outside of that API. What about the things that I'm responsible for, says the job-changing functional leader? Well, those things go to a product team. And if anybody asks, let's do a matrix org. Just no. This means that everybody on a team, all of your engineers, now have twice as many bosses that they have to keep appeased. And there's going to be jockeying for power and priority between them. And it's just going to make your engineers actively unhappy. And less productive, too. Now, I guarantee that it's going to add to your engineers' confusion and trying to keep these multiple axes of bosses happy. And really, all it takes is one functional manager in the right place to ruin the whole thing. Especially if they tend to say, give lip service to say, oh yeah, you're responsible for a priority, but I need my guy to take care of this thing. They need to run this project. Well, it's not your guy anymore. See, within the skills, by self-contained, I mean that within the team you have the skills that you need to solve the problems and operate your solutions. You have to delegate the functions that you don't possess or that are not part of your quota to solve to other teams. This is very common in like database as a service. That's often considered a separate product already in many companies. If you need specific DBA expertise for your application, by all means hire it. But oftentimes these are treated as a service anyway. Now, as far as the team itself, it's not a matter of everybody can do everything. Even on silo teams, this doesn't work. Within a product team, it's more an idea of everybody knows enough to figure out what they need to solve. So the people on this team have to be on this team. I'm going to spend this person's going to spend half their time on one team or another, or I get them for 2 days a week and another team gets them for another few days a week. That doesn't work. You're going to have that jockeying for power. You're going to have people who make better arguments, getting the better, more time that you deserve, and it ends up not being fair. Having an engineer on multiple teams causes pain, and it will cause problems. Now, a common question, how big should my team be? Well, that depends. What should make it up? Well, again, that depends. I actually think that having adjectives in front of engineer usually does more harm than good. I would love everybody on my team to be titled engineer because, people have specialties. I mean, I come from operations, but that doesn't mean that's all I do. If I have strong opinions on monitoring, which I do, well, that means I'm also kind of informed on what QA testing I'd like to see done in our integration suite before things roll out to production. Because monitoring and QA really are very similar in a lot of ways. But you may not have a dedicated operations engineer. But that doesn't mean that nobody cares about operations. It's everybody's responsibility, but there's a lot of room for cross-pollination. Your ops engineer might find a bug and file a PR. Your dev might end up writing up the test suite. And your quality folks should have strong opinions on monitoring. So having a team together is kind of a misvalued principle. It's an opportunity to make the hell that is the modern open plan office into a useful feature. So instead of being surrounded by people with similar job skills, but they're trying to solve completely different problems, having people with different job skills trying to solve the same problem is entirely helpful. Now, this is a picture of the product team from a defunct company called Zero, but it really illustrates what I like to see in a team like this. But most important is that the team works together. It doesn't mean that they're physically located together, though that is ideal, but that they communicate in the same way. So if you have a couple people here and a couple people there and isolated remotes, that means you are a completely remote team. And all your interaction happens over your group chat. And this is for everything. This is for your lunch plans. This is for, hey, I need help with, did you see that ludicrous display last night? Everything. Now, hiring and firing is always going to be a tricky subject, but it's the most important one to get right. The product team chooses its members. They know the culture that they want, the skills they need, and they're the people who have to live with the new person being brought in. However, this is a place where smart product owners will heavily leverage the functional leaders that they have access to in areas that they're not strong in. I myself, you don't want me running your databases. It's not a good time for anybody, so I'm going to heavily lean on a DBA manager to help me find the right people for me. Now, product managers, likewise, they rely on the functional leaders for guidance and assistance. And if a person isn't working out, especially technically, that functional leader can really help with training and guidance and so on. Now, you remember what I said, the functional leader is now a community role, but that becomes a real part of their job. Here's where that comes into play. They might know somebody who's looking for something new, preferably within the company. Now, it's a sad reality, but ultimately, sometimes a person just doesn't work out. They're not working out for the team, so they get cut from the team. But if there's not a place for them somewhere else in the company, well, they need to be let go from the company. What doesn't happen is that an engineer gets traded out from under the product team. This sucks. Having one of your people removed out from under you or swapped, that's even worse. And having somebody that should be working for you parted out to other teams, it's disempowering and disengaging. So if a trade happens, it needs to be discussed and, more importantly, agreed on beforehand. There should be no surprises on your team. Now, since you have all the functions within your team, whatever development and operations, QA, product design, so on and so forth, whatever you need, those people will tend to stay on the team for the long haul. Kind of like what was discussed earlier with in Microsoft. A lot of people are going to be in there for the long term, but there is room for flexibility. But since they get to know their products and their solutions intimately, this starts becoming a model for sustainable products. So what about when they're done? Dear functional leaders, they will never be done. As long as the app is in use, it has engineers behind it. How you're approaching development and deployment will influence how respective workloads look between development and operations, and as the iteration continues on. This team doesn't stop being responsible for the app when it hits production. They're responsible for the app until it leaves production, until it's retired. But eventually, your development and operations will stabilize over time. It's not going to need as many features. It's automated very well, so things run pretty smoothly. Now, and as that happens, and the team has less to do, that's when they take on more work. Whether it's more products and features within the space they're already working on, or maybe they take on a different business task that they can solve as well, now that their older workload is stabilized. But you need to have a clear understanding of how much effort goes into it. Now, as a current functional manager, you might say, I don't want my engineers doing operations. I would tell you that without operational knowledge, how are your engineers qualified to write applications for an environment they don't understand? Your ability to write quality applications will suffer, making other people suffer. And those people, namely, are whoever is doing operations and your customers. Well, again, they're not your engineers. They belong to the product team. When that product team has the capacity, then it can build new products. When they can handle it sustainably. This ends up being quite a bit of contention, but you define the product team by the products that they provide, the solutions that they provide to the business problems. Excuse me. But that's defined by the interfaces that you provide. Like any API, which should be versioned, by the way, you should provide the inputs and outputs to be expected by all of your endpoints. Also, like any API, the implementation doesn't matter as much as long as it works. This allows teams to choose, to make their own decisions without accommodating standards that were written for a different set of assumptions. Whether you want an SOA or microservices or a monolith, Perl or Python or Java or Node shop, it doesn't matter. Those decisions get to be made at the team level. So odds are, like your org chart, the standards are an artifact of another time and another problem. Your team, the standard can be a fine place to start, but the team needs to consider whether that standard even makes sense for them. Does it cause more problems than it solves? Also, having teams with a low churn allows for deep familiarization and ownership by their members. Compared to every under-provisioned ops team I've ever seen, who's responsible for everything, or engineers who are swapped into and out of products, when it happens frequently, people just care less. If I should say that every person knows everything about the system, or that person, I'm sure you have somebody in mind who knows every work, how every deployment happens, where the bodies are buried. You probably have somebody in mind. And this is very problematic because, for a lot of reasons. Has anybody not read the Phoenix Project? If you haven't, you should. It's a fantastic read. If you've been in operations, it will give you some trigger warning. But there's a character in there named Brett. There is a person who is the intersection of all handoffs. And this person is not good at sharing knowledge. They're constantly firefighting, and they may actually enjoy it. But when they do share, you finally get them to do what they're supposed to do and share. Unfortunately, they have so many assumptions about what everybody else knows that what they do share is kind of useless because there are huge gaps in that knowledge. Now, when you don't have handoffs, when everybody has specialties but their hands kind of in everything, but when everybody's familiar enough to figure things out and they're not afraid of breaking somebody else's work, they'll dig in and they'll try. As with anything, the hardest thing to do is to start. Now, if you want to get your executives excited, mention the idea of a cross-functional team. I'm not sure why, but that phrase seems to get executives all gooey. I don't understand it, but it works. Fortunately, we've already talked about what goes into identifying the products. Again, check out Fear, Loathing, and Systems Administration for how to go about that. But you should absolutely work with your current ops folks for how to do this. Stand up a team to start something new, or take on a critical but orphaned product. Personally, I think I can talk a lot to insight tooling and config management. These are things that tend to get installed somewhere and left alone to run in the corner until it fails. You have a new feature to write? Fantastic. Start with what the consumer experience is supposed to be like. What are the inputs and outputs that you as a consumer would want? And again, within your team, decide what's your release cadence? What does your CI and CD look like? What kind of Git branching methods? It doesn't matter to anybody else. You get to decide. You have a lovely green field ahead of you. And again, somebody proposes a matrix organization, you need to be extremely careful. It's important that you have a separation of church and state between your functional leadership and your product. So again, all work comes from product management. Functional leadership is for individual careers and sharing of knowledge. Now, this shouldn't be hard to remember. Oh, thanks. This shouldn't be hard to remember, is functional leaders shouldn't honestly have any work to assign, but this is going to be hard because there's a lot of muscle memory that they want to take charge and go get something. But really, it needs to be remembered that the product owners own the work. Now, I know a lot of you are skeptical about how a product team actually works. You might just not believe me. But if you properly staff a team, give them direction, and get out of their way, they're going to amaze you. Now, this approach orients towards DevOps and cloud native, even when those things aren't actively pursued. And this is all the reason why I consider that product teams are the definitive implementation of DevOps. Here's the thing. It's not the only way, but I think that product teams are the simplest way to ensure that you are aligning responsibility with authority and that your products are maintained and sustainable. It's not to say that other implementations can't work, but they make things more difficult by misaligning reporting structures with responsibilities. So to recap, we keep people engaged by aligning authority with responsibility, making people who write the apps the same people who run and maintain them. The people who write the apps are also the principal stakeholders. They're most directly responsible for their own quality of lives, because if they write apps that are not resilient, they're going to sleep poorly, and you can bet those things are going to get prioritized. When teams run their own apps, they're incentivized to make them stable. Once their apps are stable, they're going to be willing and eager even to add new features. But they'll push back on adding new features until they have a quality of life. By grouping teams into smaller units, it's easier to gauge how engaged they are and what their capacity looks like when dealing with their workload. Now, if a team can't get out from under its own workload, either people are added to the team or responsibilities are removed and you spin up a new team. Since the team that writes its own app is the one responsible for running and maintaining it, apps aren't orphaned. You should never have legacy apps anymore because they should never get so far out of date that nobody knows how it works and you can't update for security vulnerabilities. If it stays evergreen, it's easier to maintain. Now with that, thank you. Let's go plant some trees. If you want to talk later, I'll be out where the beverages are. Feel free to propose an open space.